All right, it is at 2:30 mark. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our composting class today. My name is Jessie and I am a staff with the YMCA Earth Service Corps. And we're partnering today with Tilth Alliance. They have a group called the Master Composters who are certified composting experts. And they're going to be sharing with us a little bit today about how to compost. Take it away, Master Composters.
Howdy, this is Alex again. I will be presenting the first 4 slides here for you. And rather than just reading what's on there, I would encourage you to answer some of these questions I have about what you see here. And I'd like to start by talking about the graphic. And feel free to turn on your audio or type it into the chat. So the first thing I want to pose to you is, what is a microbe? Does anybody have an idea what that is, what that means? Okay, well, a microbe, you could see that as a microorganism. Just think of it, very, very small living thing. And what we see in this graphic, we see some arrows going towards the microbe. In this case, it's what's feeding the microbe. And we have some arrows pointing away, and that would be, as part of the decomposition process, what is emitted. We have CO2, all those carbon dioxide, we have H2O, water, and it looks like our microbe in this graphic is being fed by croissants, baguette, and brioche. We'll talk a little bit about that later as to what the diet is for a microbe. I'm done with the slides, so Jessica, if you want to go to the second one. So going off of microbes, see this graphic here, it looks like a pretty complex system of battle, warfare. There's a lot of things going on in your compost pile. And as we see from the title here, microbes are breaking down organic matter, and in that process, they're obtaining energy and acquiring nutrients to sustain populations. And as we'll find out later, this is a cyclical system in that this is ongoing, continuous sort of regeneration and breakdown and generation of microbes. Since we're so short on time, can't really talk about each of these players in the system, but I did want to talk about actinomycetes, and you may find that it's right by molds and fungi. An important little fact about that, or about actinomycetes, is they play an important role in degrading complex organics, including tough debris such as wood bark, using enzymes. A little bit more about enzymes and the process of breaking down organic matters. If we remember from our previous graphic, oxygen is involved in the breakdown. So that's acting as a metabolizer and also keeping aeration, so there's no anaerobic decay. We can go to the next slide. And here we start talking about how we're feeding our compost piles. So we have, talking about greens, see those as nitrogen, and 50% brown would be our carbons. So you can think of browns as dead leaves in the fall, and greens as, maybe Roger or Simon can help me out with this one. When we did our compost piles, was it vetch? Is that what we used to? No, that's a weed.
It can be grass clippings. Sorry, grass clippings,
right.
vetch, weeds, pruning, I mean, anything that looks green from your yard or your garden. It also
Thank you, Roger.
includes things like coffee grounds.
Thank you, Roger. I can't quite see the bottom of the slide, but as we're talking about the ideal environment and feed for our compost piles, I also want to mention water. As you may remember, in our first graphic, H2O was a part of this process, and in our training, we talked about like a wrung out sponge. So when you're feeding your compost pile with your greens and your browns, you also want to include some water in that process, because water is the source of life, even for these little guys. And like a wrung out sponge. So it's essentially just taking a nice mixture of these greens and browns, squeezing it, and resembles a sponge being wrung out. Next slide, please. So an elaboration of our feedstocks, carbons, browns, and nitrogens. Like we talked about, brown leaves. Here for nitrogens, green plant tissue. As Roger pointed out, we have grass clippings, stems, leaves. Yeah, pretty straightforward, this one. So I believe Simon will be taking over the next portion of our presentation.
I'll jump into the driver's seat. Hello again, everyone. And Jesse, we can go ahead to the next slide. All right, so what else do you need? What else do you need to know? So Alex mentioned the importance of having water. So as moist as a wrung out sponge, basically a few drops when you squeeze, if you were to pick up a pile from your composting. Another important thing to keep in mind is the air portion of it. So when you think about aerobic versus anaerobic, so anaerobic would be like when you go to, and I don't know why I'm blanking on the name, but the piles, that factories have that basically there's no air going through it. And the issue with that versus what we're doing with composting is we've got air going through it, aerobic, and that's preventing a lot of the bad gases that go out into the environment from forming, as opposed to when you have anaerobic, no air going through in these big, massive, piles of waste that is emitting a lot of bad gases. So in terms of volume, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet per bin that you'd be using for your compost pile. Sometimes you'll have several of them stacked next to each other, and you want some size because you're going to be digging in there with a shovel. You're going to be rotating the soil and all the particles around, and mixing them around. So you want some space to be able to do that, and some space to be able to mix everything together. And then in terms of the particle size, so the ideal size, 1 to 2 inches. What you can do when you think about if you've ever been to Benihana, and you see them like chopping up all the different stuff at the restaurant and putting it on a grill. You can, like, one of the things that we would do is we would take like a little machete, and we'd have all of our compost particles, and then we would just sit there and kind of chop it up, almost like Benihana style. So there's a lot of different ways that you can be creative with that to get your particle size down to 1 to 2 inches, because obviously if you put like a big branch in there, or other big particles, it's going to take a lot longer to decompose. So we can go on to the next slide. All right, so the thing that we're doing with composting is when all of these organisms and bacteria and fungi, when they all start working together, it's like alchemy. You get these high temperatures, and that's what ultimately helps to decompose and kill off any diseases or unwanted particles that are in there. So the mesophiles, that stage lasts for a couple of days. And then the thermophiles, that lasts anywhere from a couple of days to a couple of months. And it's really cool because when you go into your composting bin and things start to heat up, all of these things start to work together, you will see like smoke rising from it, and you can stick a thermometer in there to check out what temperature you're at. So we definitely want to encourage the temperatures to rise to make all that's decomposing work effectively. The actinobacteria is what does the heavy lifting, I would say, the majority of the composting, and that's what helps give our compost that really nice earthy smell. So just like a dead log, that beautiful smell that you get from a dead log in the forest, that's what is created from the actinobacteria. And then the fungi, those come in and they help if anything is too dry or acidic or too low in nitrogen, that the actinobacteria wasn't able to do its thing. The fungi comes in and is able to continue that decomposition process. And go on to the next slide. So when to say no. So there are certain things that we don't want to be putting into our compost bin. In an earlier slide, you saw you could put in like animal waste, but it's just certain types of animals. So cows and sheep, and I remember one person mentioned that they have chickens. All of that type of pet waste is great, but dogs, cats, human waste, we don't want to include that in there. And then other things not to include, so poisonous plants, weeds that have gone to seed, invasive plants, so a lot of ivy in this area, this region. So things like that. We want to make sure that we don't put that into our compost, because that can't really get broken down as well, if at all. And that will come back when we start using that compost, then it'll just like regenerate these bad things. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so harvesting, when is compost ready to use? So the key, you kind of get this like beautiful smelling, you can call it like black gold. It's crumbly, it smells really earthy, almost sweet. And that's really the true litmus test. And you can see like those two different pictures. The one on top, everything hasn't decomposed yet. It's still in kind of chunky, and it hasn't really reached that beautiful brown, crumbly color that you see in the lower picture. So the key is just, we're going to keep adding the right amounts of carbon and nitrogen, and rotating things and giving it time, and until we ultimately get to that black gold that we'll use for our gardens. So with that, I will turn it over to Roger.
Great. Can you go next slide, Jessica? Next slide. Keep going. Keep going. That's great. All right. No, I want to go back to the previous one. Can you go back one? Great. Okay. So in the city, we try to make distinctions, or we need to make distinctions between composting things from the yard, leaves, grass clippings, even some of the pet chicken waste, rabbit pellets, or whatever that we have, and food waste. Can you go to the next slide, please? All right. So in this city, everyone is required to not put their food or yard waste in the garbage, and the utility has special, the green bins, and you're supposed to put your food and yard waste in those. If you want to compost, then you're taking the food waste part, and then you are doing that in a separate process. So let's go back to the one with the rats. Let's explain why we're doing that. So we're doing that because in the city we have rats. And we don't want rats in our compost. Rats carry diseases. We don't also want them in our houses, so we don't want to attract them toward our house. So we try to keep them out of our compost. Rats are not terribly attracted to yard waste, but they are to food, particularly cooked food, things that are greasy or have dairy products or meat or fish will attract rats. So we're composting, need to keep those things in, and we have separate systems for composting food from yard waste. Now we go to the next one. Next slide. Yeah, great. Okay, so here's just some examples of different ways to compost. On the top left, you'll see what we call a 3-bin process that's mostly used for yard waste. The one in the center, the tumbler, can be used for either yard waste or food waste. Note that it would be hard for a rat to get into that. And the other 3 systems there are ideally for food waste, and we'll talk more about that in a little while. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so I was asked to mostly focus on worm bins, that people were excited about worms. You can compost food waste in something called a digester, and we won't cover that today. It is important to note here on the bottom that you can always call the garden hotline, not only for help with gardening, but for composting. So this is a good number to have. They're available Monday through Saturday during the day. And then you can also get more information on the Tilth Alliance website. There's information about composting, and then there are instructions for how to build composters if you want to do that yourself. Basically, for worm composting, we're taking advantage of this special kind of worm, which we call red wiggler. This is the scientific name, Eisenia fetida. And they're smaller than the earthworms you generally would see in your yard. And these are the ones that like to digest debris, in our case, food waste. And then they break that down, and what they excrete is a really rich source of nitrogen and minerals, and is wonderful as a soil amendment. The 3 basic types of systems. There's the one in the upper right is a big bin. It's generally 2 feet by 4 feet, and it is a large size, maybe good for a family. The one underneath that is a plastic bin, and it can be any size. It's generally smaller, and Tilth has directions for how to construct those. And those are actually ones people can have in their house. It's a small unit, it's self-contained, it doesn't leak water, and if you're doing it correctly, it shouldn't have any odor to it. Commercially, you can buy these stacked systems, and that's what the middle picture is about. Okay, next slide. So if you're going to create a worm bin, there's some important things because you need the right environment. So yeah.
Sorry, I had some
No, we're not on the right screen here.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, so
there we go. I did want
wow, this is a whole, yeah, that's a whole different. That was a whole different slideshow. Okay, next slide.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to give you a heads up.
Yeah, that's all right. I'll try not to take too much time. So if you're going to create a worm bin, the worms need not only food, but they need bedding, which generally is strips of newspaper or cardboard. It's moist, so it's like a wrung out sponge, like in the yard waste environment, and a little bit of sand or something because the worms have gizzards. They don't have teeth, and so they need sand to be grit in their digestive system to break up the food. So you need bedding, moist bedding. You have worms, and then as you generate food waste, you would bury it in part of your worm bin. And then as you have more waste, you bury it in a slightly different part, and you kind of move throughout the bin. And the worms, when they finish digesting the first food that's there, they move to where the new food is. So that's basically how that system works. In a way, you could think of worms as pets. They need to have, they don't need to be walked daily, many times a day, like a dog, but they do need to be kept in the right temperature range, say 50 to 80 degrees, which means on a really hot, sunny summer day, you might want to make sure it's in the shade. And they need to be kept moist, and they need to be kept with sufficient amount of food. And then depending on how many worms you have and how much food you put in, this process can be really quick. It might even not take 3 months in ideal situations, or if you don't have very many worms, it might take a much longer period of time. Next slide. Okay, so this is sort of the wrap up. This is a comprehensive composting guide for composting at home that Tilth has available, and you can receive these either by calling the hotline or sending them an email. Here's their email address, gardenhotline.org. Or you can go to the Tilth Alliance website, and these should be available. And it's a very straightforward manual for the various systems we've talked about with pictures. And so I think it'd be very helpful for you if you want to actually start doing this at home. I think that's the end of the slides. Okay. So now we have time for questions.
Yeah, so we're going to open it up to just some general questions at this point. Benjamin asks, what are the biggest differences between industrial composting and home composting?
We had a slide that showed the various temperatures and the different types of bacteria. The main advantage of a commercial composting system is that they're able to control their environment much more so than you can at home. They have a huge supply of materials generally, and they have often sophisticated ways of making sure there's enough moisture and enough oxygen in their system. And so they can achieve much higher temperatures, which are necessary to kill things like plant diseases and kill seeds from weeds and other things that you might not want to put in your compost at home.
And then I'll just add, because I had alluded to and incorrectly said industrial. What I meant to say was landfill, to kind of contrast between you know, a home composting where you're getting that aerobic you know, air filtration versus landfills that there's no air going through that. And then there's, you know, industrial composting, which, like Roger said, is just like a more regulated, you know, if you think about it like home brewing, beer home brewing versus like a micro brewery or a big brewery that has, you know, large equipment and has it all, you know, regulated, so they can get the exact same results every time. And that's kind of the way I look at it, and might be a helpful analogy.
Tessa wanted to know, where do you get worms?
You know, really, it depends. I've been able to get them at places, some nurseries, and also been able to get them at some hardware stores where they might ordinarily have been selling them as fishing bait. You can also order them online. There's no like good single source that I can tell you about that seems to work in this area. And I think there's a place in Olympia that ships them, and they would get here pretty quickly. So
you can get them at fly shops as well if you're into fishing. You can get worms there.
Does anyone else have
some question about how many worms do you need? You can think about it this way, that it kind of depends on how much food you have. You're a big family, you have a lot of food waste, you might need more worms. If you're one person and you live by yourself, you may not need so many worms. Generally, you end up buying the worms that are like, I don't know what, like maybe you get a cup or a pint container, takeout container of worms. And that would be a good start. Worms will generate more worms, so they will produce baby worms regularly in the right environment. So you'll eventually get lots more worms. Should I just continue answering these worm bin questions? Yeah, it kind of depends on what kind of bin you have. If you have one of those tiered bins, they're designed so that the worms move from one bin to the next bin when the food's all used up, and then you take the bin out that is all done, and then you have your finished product. If you have a bigger bin, as the worms move through the bin, they leave behind the finished product, and so periodically you have to go in and take that out and put more bedding in. And then if you wait for the whole bin to be complete, then you have to take it all out, and then it's harder to separate the worms from the finished product. So then you have that to contend with, but worms generally don't like the light, so you take advantage of that, and they move away from the light, and then you take away that finished compost. You put the worms back in the bin with more bedding, and you start over again.